Rishi is here to speak to us about water and Haiti and cholera, which are issues he's been very much involved in. He is head of a program of physicians for Haiti, in which really it takes such a great concept we hear about involving the local communities, but Rishi's group really does that full on by training the doctors and training the health practitioners in Haiti. So when the NGOs and those from other countries pull back, there's stuff still ongoing in the target country, and that's something that I've been very interested in. As you see, all the projects that I've been working on, once the money's gone and the NGOs pull away, does it stick? Does it keep going? Does it have legs to it? And can it continue? And that's what's great about what Rishi's work is. It's really a good friend, and we're really pleased to have you here.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for having me. I'm glad to hear about all your various backgrounds. I think that I'm hoping today will be more of a conversation. What I'm going to be talking about is basically our work in not necessarily the water sector, but the advocacy sector around the human right to water in the context of the UN introduction of cholera. Of course, going with that, their denial of their responsibility. And basically where we stand is at the intersection of scientists and technical experts in water, engineering, and cholera, and that intersection between that and policy and politics. And so it's sort of a tenuous position at times because policymakers often have trouble understanding the scientific literature, and scientists often shy away from engaging in policy making for fear of appearing biased or politicized or losing credibility. And so what our work strives to do is to bridge that gap in order to create evidence-based policy reform, particularly at the UN, as you'll hear shortly. So just a bit of background. Certainly, Haiti does not have the worst water security problem in the world, but it is a very significant problem, and certainly the worst in the Western Hemisphere. Just some quick numbers for you in terms of how severe lack of access is. In terms of people that have access to an improved water source, only about 51% have had access to that in the past decade or so. You can see that over the past decade there has been an increase in access to an improved water source across the world, and Haiti has actually followed that trend pretty well. But when you look at subgroup analyses of that statistic and that number, what you find is that it's the rural areas, which is a majority of Haitians, actually have held flat and don't have improved access to water over the last decade. So there's been no progress in improving access to water in the rural areas of Haiti. And that certainly sets the context and stage and landscape for cholera, which originated in the rural areas of Haiti, not the IDP camps as would have been predicted by CDC and other health organizations immediately after the earthquake. Again, numbers that I'm sure you guys are aware of, but certainly that this water shortage doesn't just affect people who are gathering the water, but also the children are also in families oftentimes tasked with gathering water, and that affects their education. So as I'm sure you all know, the right to water is intimately interconnected with other rights. Right to life, right to education, right to food security, right to shelter, right to safety. So you can't talk about one without the other, and you can't work on one without realizing the sort of ripple effect lack of access to water has on other people's rights. However, Haiti does have the distinction of being the only country in the world over the last 2 decades where sanitation coverage has decreased. Now, if you think about the time between 1990 and 2010, and think about the various wars that have happened in countries both in the Middle East mostly the Middle East as well as Eastern Africa and Central Africa. If you think about the natural disasters that have happened, even through all of that, each country throughout this time period has been able to increase their sanitation coverage. Haiti, which has not had a war, and other than this is pre-earthquake, which has not had a war or a significant natural disaster in that time, actually lost sanitation coverage. So in this era where you have a flat non-increase in access to water and a decrease in access to sanitation coverage, this is a setup for, as I mentioned, problems with accessing and securing other human rights, in particular health. Diarrhea is the second leading cause of death of people of all ages in Haiti, but it's actually the #1 cause for children under 5. And so certainly, again, it's been directly shown, there's been direct connection between lack of access to water, a failure to secure the right to water, and the ill effects on health, and Haiti is no different there. In terms of interventions, one of the interventions that you may have heard about in the last, say, 6 months that the UN has been publicizing a lot is their work on creating the first sewage treatment plants in Haiti. In fact, they created 2. There's been a lot of talk immediately after the earthquake about decentralizing efforts in reconstruction, again, focusing on the rural areas where there's been no improvement in water security. However, both these waste treatment centers are around Port-au-Prince. The importance not only of the lack of decentralization of this, but also the planning of this will come into the advocacy talk in the kind of second and third portions of my little brief here. Because when the UN worked with the Haitian government on creating these plants, they secured construction costs, but didn't secure any maintenance or operating costs. So both these plants were constructed, they're brand new, and they have no money, so neither of them are functioning. In fact, I spoke to a colleague of mine who is a journalist that's worked with New York Times and Al Jazeera English and The Guardian, a Canadian journalist who actually visited these sites in the last month, and neither of them are functional because they have no funding. Their plan for funding is that they would charge private sanitation companies $4 per cubic meter to dump their waste, keeping in mind that these sanitation companies previously paid $0 to dump their waste wherever they pleased. There was no regulation, and there currently still is no regulation about where they should dump. So it's more of an honor system saying, will you do the right thing and pay essentially 4 times as much as you were paying to dump sewage here for treatment. And so obviously nobody has taken them up on their offer, and they remain non-functional. And that sort of is the archetype of how aid and development has worked in Haiti, where people are scrambling to get the initial funding, and the ribbon-cutting ceremony is very well attended, and then everything, all the funding disappears and evaporates, and nothing comes of it. Caracol Industrial Park, the only industrial park in Haiti that's been built on environmentally protected land, also would be the third area that has a functioning water and sanitation system, but it is also non-functional, and in fact much of the industrial park is non-functional as well, despite a $220 million investment by foreign investors in order for that industrial park to produce cheap textiles for largely North America. So again, this is all the talk and discussion about the UN and water advocacy is in the context of this very faulty, ethically suspect international aid and development in the way that has functioned in Haiti, not just since the earthquake, but really for the past 200 years in the history of Haiti. So just as a kind of summarizing statistic, this was a study that was done in a fairly urban town. So this is actually urban. This is not even rural, but in an urban town, the vast majority of people, virtually everyone, struggles to find water at some point during their year. The study period of this study was about a month or so, but in that month, when asking if they always had access to water, only 2% said they did. Again, this is an urban environment, not a rural environment. And then one of the things that I find very sobering is that this is all before the earthquake. This is all before cholera hit. So all these numbers, which are pretty devastating, I think, already, are much worse. That much is guaranteed. In fact, there hasn't been enough funding and structure and infrastructure to do updated studies and statistics, so pretty much all our information about water security in Haiti stops in 2010. Even the 2012 reports by UNICEF and WHO on the Joint Management Program reports, their 2012 reports still cite only 2010 data. So we actually have no idea what the water situation in Haiti is. All we know is that it was the worst in the Western Hemisphere beforehand. And again, speaking of context, the government didn't have a centralized national water system until about 2006. And again, they didn't have any facilities which they looked over. And in that context, the private NGOs have done a lot of work. Often you'll hear the term coined by Amy Willens of Haiti being the Republic of NGOs. Haiti is a country that's 11,000 square miles. There are about 10,000 NGOs registered in Haiti, many more unregistered. One of the things that I think that what I'd like to talk about and think about is if we are putting our money into this NGO network and infrastructure and giving 10,000 NGOs access to Haiti and the land and the people to work, and things are getting worse year by year, taking away natural disasters, is this really the appropriate venue to be investing in? Regardless of the 10,000 NGOs, actually surprisingly few are focused on water and sanitation. As you can see, the darker the red focuses on areas that have more organizations working on water and sanitation, and the dark reds are just 4 organizations. So you see the majority of Haiti, and in particular the Artibonite and Central Plateau, where cholera originated and which are the poorest areas of Haiti, have vanishingly few organizations that are working with Haitian communities to secure their right to water. Now to talk about cholera. Cholera has been around for millennia, originating in South Asia. Again, probably most of this information you know. We're currently in our 7th pandemic, which started in 1961 around Indonesia and has spread to North America, actually in the Western Hemisphere, in the 1980s. But despite that, and despite going across the Caribbean, Haiti, in its entire recorded history, has never had a cholera epidemic. Not a single one. In that context, we have MINUSTA, which is the UN military mission to Haiti. MINUSTA received their first mandate in 2004, and it was to establish a rule of law. Interestingly, the person who first requested a UN presence was one of the first democratically elected people, President Aristide. He requested a UN presence because of decreasing infrastructure and rule of law and justice, and he was denied. However, French, Canadian, and American-funded military planes then escorted him or spirited him away from his country, despite him being the elected leader. And U.S. Marines were on Haitian soil within 24 hours. To put that in context, in 2004, when they landed on Haitian soil as a precursor to the UN military movement, they had a faster response time after Aristide was deposed than to the Haiti earthquake. The last time Americans had landed on soil, Haitian soil like that, was 1915, in the early 20th century, where they stayed unwelcome for about 25 years. Their first order of business at that time was to rewrite the Haitian Constitution to allow private corporations that were registered internationally to own land and property in Haiti. So the U.S. has had quite a tempestuous relationship, both financially and economically and politically, with Haiti, and that's no different in this decade as well. MINUSTA is spread throughout Haiti. They started again as a rule of law organization, but mission creep and expanded mandates expanded them into development and social areas, including the right to water. Despite that, the water access and water security, as measured by the Water Poverty Index, got worse every year that MINUSTA was there. One of the camps in Mirebalais, which is in the Central Plateau, is housed by, it had multiple different MINUSTA units, but they, like many other of the MINUSTA camps, have a blackwater open soak pit. So as you can see here, this is an open pit. You see that the fencing here is not complete, and so often this is only one representative picture, but there are other documentation, again, documented by the UN themselves, of animals and children playing in the soak pit directly into the ground. This is, again, untreated black water from their camps. 3 different camps dump their water here all across the Central Plateau, in Terre Rouge, Hinche, and Mirebalais. Again, these are open soak pits. During the rainy season, citizens around the area often complain to the mayor of Mirebalais that this water overflowed. This was on the top of a hill right next to a river. So it overflowed down the hill directly into the river, causing contamination. Despite their complaints for a couple of years, nothing was done. In this context, Nepalese troops arrived in October of 2010. In the preceding summer, while they were being trained by the Nepalese army in Kathmandu, there was a Nepal epidemic. This epidemic swept across the country of Nepal, and just a number that I want you to remember, it killed 9 people. This countrywide epidemic in Nepal killed 9 people. So in September, it hit Kathmandu specifically, where all the Nepalese troops were training. And then they underwent a UN medical screening. Once the screening was done, they were given leave to go across the rest of the country, again, which was still suffering an epidemic, for 10 days, and then they were shipped directly to Haiti with no further or intervening medical screening. The medical screening that's done based on the UN Medical Support Manual, part of the Department of Field Support, suggests that if someone is asymptomatic, meaning does not have any diarrhea, there's no need to screen them or test them for cholera. It's actually been known for about 40 years in the medical literature that the majority of people that can infect someone else with cholera are asymptomatic. That's at a baseline, all comers. In areas where cholera is endemic, such as Nepal, that number is actually higher, and sometimes as high as 75%. 75% of people who are in an endemic area like Nepal, who has experienced an epidemic at that time, are asymptomatic yet still shed cholera in their stools and still can infect people. Cholera does create an immunity once you're exposed to it, so people who have never been exposed to it all have a much greater sensitivity and have a much higher severity of disease than another person. So for example, if a Nepalese troop is asymptomatic or has a mild case of diarrhea, that wouldn't really show up on anybody's radar as something infectious that needs to be treated, that could still kill a Haitian who's never been exposed to cholera before. And indeed, that's what happened. Shortly after the Nepalese troops arrived, they actually arrived on the 8th, 9th, and 12th into Mirebalais. A man drank from a river about just a couple yards away from the camp that had visible sewage seeping into the river. He died within 24 hours. The funeral workers that prepared his body, his funeral was the 14th, were sickened within 48 hours. By the 18th of October, the Cuban Medical Brigade, which was the only stable medical cadre there in Mirebalais, documented 61 cases of acute watery diarrhea. And within 72 hours, the cases had jumped to over 3,000. At its worst, 3 people were presenting a minute every 60 seconds to these hospitals, which normally only have about 50 to 40 beds. People ran out of supplies. My colleagues ran out of supplies within the first day. And what was incredibly frustrating is, as you know, to treat cholera requires usually just rehydration, just a simple salt and sugar solution in the IV. And oftentimes, my Haitian colleagues, would have IV fluid, but not the tubing to instill it. Or they would have tubing, but would have run out of fluid. And in those first days, all they could do was watch people die of dehydration, which is actually a slow death, even in cholera, where you're defecating liters and liters of fluid, an hour even, and a day. A death from dehydration is one that's very very upsetting and very hard to watch. So it was very hard for all these physicians who had read about cholera as a historic disease of antiquity in their textbooks and had never been affected by it to see it all around them and overwhelming their medical systems.
Just adding one quick thing to the Rishi, these hospitals were already overtaxed and stressed. These patients were just admitted, a couple of them, and they were already at capacity, and all of a sudden they have to deal with this epidemic.
Absolutely. Absolutely. A couple days after the government issued a nationwide cholera alert, they dispatched a team of Haitian epidemiologists to the patient zero site, just like any other country would when they're investigating an epidemic, and just like any other country, and based on the standards of science and epidemiology, went to go look at the source of water that patient zero drank from, and found it next to this camp where they noticed sewage seeping into the river. So they went to the camp, again, a camp that's on sovereign Haitian soil. They went as government employees and requested access to the camp to treat the water and observe the sanitation systems. They were denied access to that camp by UN field officers, and 4 days later, MINUSTA denied involvement. Regardless, investigative journalists, both Haitian as well as international, multiple journalists, documented waste leaking from many different areas of the MINUSTA base into both the soil as well as the tributary next to it. Again, this tributary ran into the biggest river of Haiti, which feeds the breadbasket of Haiti downstream. So cholera spread extremely quickly in Haiti, basically following the velocities of the river. And based on the river velocities and hydrological studies, a drop of water in Mirebalais takes about 2 days to reach the coast. And you saw within 48 hours that entire river basin down to the coast was sickened. Thousands upon thousands of people were sickened. In February of 2011, so about 5 months after the outbreak, due to international pressure based on mostly the investigative journalist reports coming out of there, dispatched a UN independent commission, but a UN-commissioned investigative team to Haiti to look at the origin of cholera. On this team was a former fellow of the Carr Center, Danielle Lantan, who had done extensive work in many, many countries on water systems as well as cholera and sanitation, both with MIT as well as the Carr Center. And because of that work at Harvard and MIT, was invited to be one of the lead authors and lead investigators of this report. In the final report, it was printed that the strains isolated in Haiti and Nepal during 2009 were a perfect match. However, that actually ended up being a typo. What it should have read is that the strains isolated in Haiti and Nepal during 2010 were a perfect match. It seems like a small typo, just a difference of a year. But what the United Nations was able to say when it said 2009 was that, well, we weren't able to directly compare cholera in Haiti to the cholera that was around during the Nepal epidemic. Remember, again, the one that killed 9 people during the entire months-long epidemic versus the thousands that have died in Haiti. So they said, well, you know, the cholera hasn't been compared to the appropriate strain in Nepal. But in fact, the International Vaccine Institute based out of Seoul, South Korea, which did do the testing, were testing it against the 2010 strain. And this was not documented in the UN final report. There was never an erratum published, and it was never acknowledged by the United Nations. In July 19th, Dr. Kim of the International Vaccine Institute did note the typo, but this wasn't published in the literature until about March of 2012. In April, I spoke with some of the authors of the UN report, and they said they were aware of the typo, but had no plans on publishing an erratum because at this point, they were no longer affiliated with the UN, and it was a UN document, so they didn't have the authority to publish that erratum. But unfortunately, the UN has failed to acknowledge that they were actually the first group to find a direct link between the Nepal strains and the Haiti strains. Because of the lack of acknowledgement by the United Nations and then spurred on also by scientific inquiry, 9 different research groups across the world also looked into the origins of cholera, specifically looking at South Asia. Only one was able to obtain the strains from the Nepal government from the 2010 outbreak, and it was an exact match. and they actually use that words, and for the scientists in the room, you know how rare it is for scientists to say something's 100%. But they said in their article that it's an exact match, and the leading cholera experts in the world, who actually also happen to be UN co-authors of the report, said it was irrefutable molecular evidence, and that these were identical. Despite this, the UN has failed to acknowledge responsibility, and that's where the intersection lies, the intersection between the scientific findings and the disconnect between the United Nations findings. Different people and different groups of people reacted to it differently, and were looking for different things. The civil society was very angry, and I think this picture captures a lot of the sentiment in Haiti and how they felt in terms of their treatment by the international community stretching back 200 years. Here this says Aba cholera, which means against cholera. But if you look at some of the other signs, this here says nous pas gain de l'eau potable, which is we do not have potable water or clean water. Haitians are not dogs, which I think is a very powerful statement. Haiti is not l'État means I can't remember. Yeah. And then over here, people are perishing. And Gonaïve, Tuneville Lamo, Gonaïve has returned to the village of death. So a lot of different sentiments, not just against cholera, the United Nations, but just sort of their general sentiment of how they feel in terms of treatment by the international community and what they feel their rights are. They mostly directed their anger at the United Nations. That was, despite peaceful protests, was often met violently. And they also directed their anger at the Haitian government. The Haitian government is in a tough position because they believe the science. Their scientists themselves were the first to find the origins of cholera. But in the United Nations world, they're highly dependent on external sources of funding. Their 2013-2014 budget, 67% of that comes from international foreign governments. These are the foreign governments that also majorly fund MINUSTA and the military mission. So they feel very much, speaking with them sort of in off the record, that their hands are tied in terms of acknowledging the true source of cholera. Even just yesterday, in fact, the Prime Minister was here at Harvard speaking about being open for business and investment in Haiti. And investment in Haiti. And when he was asked about cholera by a Haitian national, basically said it's no longer an issue. And that this is not something that we need to focus on. Unfortunately, while the mortality rate from cholera has gone down, cholera is becoming endemic in Haiti to such a point that actually the numbers have doubled since last year. So the cases of cholera are increasing, and as the rainy season starts, they will only increase more.
UN still not admitted responsibility?
Correct.
Correct.
To this day, correct. And again, actually, this is an important one, so I'll just go back to it. Haiti pas gain l'État. Haiti doesn't have a state with a capital S, meaning Haiti doesn't. So the feelings that there really isn't a national infrastructure. And again, what is the role of advocacy, and in particular technical experts in that? Where civil society failed, the legal community tried to sue the United Nations. Pictured, you see Mario Joseph, who is the head of Bureau Avocats Internationaux, and Brian Kincannon, who is actually Boston-based, who's the head of Institute for Justice and Democracy in Haiti. They sued the UN, not that there's a jurisdiction in which the United Nations can be sued, but they sent the UN a lawsuit with 15,000 petitioners of people who've been affected by cholera, basically asking for acknowledgement, an apology, and basically damages or payment to people affected by cholera in terms of earnings lost. However, just last month, the United Nations rejected the claim. Ban Ki-moon, in a bit of irony, basically said that the UN had immunity from the cholera lawsuit, which is ironic to me because the Haitians had no immunity from cholera itself. And it's interesting that they chose that wording. So in that vacuum of legal struggles and not having jurisdiction, and civil society not not being able to gain traction either with the United Nations because they're not able to access the people in power, or their government, again, partially also not being able to access the people in power, is where Physicians for Haiti stepped in. We have a strong network of technical experts and cholera experts in Haiti and internationally, and we felt there was a disconnect. And when we talked to Haitians, certainly Haitians were very angry and wanted money and reparations and damages, but really what they wanted is for it to not happen again. And when we looked at how physicians and scientists could make that happen, it really came down to advocating at the United Nations level. Again, looking at the medical support manual of the Department of Field Support and their 40-year out-of-date medical screening policy, as well as some of their waste policies. For example, none of their black water is treated before it goes off-site. They hold their black water in relatively small fiberglass tanks because these camps are relatively small, 2,500 liters or so. So they're picked up every week. The amount of bleach and the dilution of bleach that would be needed to treat that, to at least neutralize any sort of infectious bacteria, is less than a liter. In addition, it's more dilute than household bleach. So it doesn't require any special handling. Many international organizations already follow this as a standard to treat their black water on site before it leaves the site. So if any spillage happens or dumping by a private company, it doesn't cause any infection. The United Nations, even in this past year, have explicitly said to me that they will never treat with black water, even when we created a scenario for them to receive free of charge the bleach distributed to all their camps, working with some Haitian organizations that make the bleach through, make the sodium hypochlorite through electrolysis manufacturing on the coast using the salt water from the ocean. Pardon?
Did they say why?
They did not. They did not say why. And so over the course of the last year and a half, we've briefed over 30 different UN entities and officials, from Undersecretary Generals and Assistant Secretary Generals in peacekeeping, the humanitarian arm, the development arm, the Security Council arm, and the General Assembly, as well as diplomats of various countries that are heavily invested in Haiti. First, our first round of briefings were educational, to explain to them the cause of cholera, because the only information we found that people had read was the UN report. And in fact, the people writing the policies, not a single person writing the policy had ever read a primary source document about the origins of cholera or how to prevent future outbreaks. In addition, most people writing the policies didn't actually read the full UN report. They just read the summary. So they were not using, they didn't have informed ideas about what the problem, what brought cholera to Haiti, so how they can stop that when they were writing the policy. Our second round was actually advocating with the policymakers down to the sort of secretarial or young, 20-something people out of college that are actually writing the policy, typing it on their own computer, to the people who are going to be arguing it and passing it in the UN Security Council. Much of this work was documented in some studies that we published recently, and one of the end results of this was that a UN Security Council resolution, for the first time in Security Council history, acknowledged the United Nations role in water security and cholera. While they didn't acknowledge introducing cholera, they certainly acknowledged that they have a primary role based on how cholera got there in responding to it, not only responding to cholera, but responding to the water security problem and the lack of access to clean water in Haiti. When we talked to the scientists, we spoke to every single scientific research group that researched the origins of cholera, and with the help of Danielle, who is a UN co-author and again former Carr fellow, we constructed a consensus statement that basically said, was a single sentence, and said that the most likely source of cholera in Haiti is MINUSTA. Every single scientific group who researched cholera agreed with that statement and in fact helped write it. Not a single one was willing to come forward publicly and say publicly that they were willing to support that. In fact, the only person, or the first person rather, to come forward publicly months and months and months before anyone came forward, any scientist came forward talking about the source, and before Bill Clinton made his famous statement in Mirabale saying that it was from a UN peacekeeper, was Danielle herself. in an Al Jazeera English interview, she herself said that she was reversing the findings of the UN report in her own mind based on the scientific evidence, and that the MINUSTA was the most likely source. Since that time, one of her co-authors, who's a cholera expert, has also come forward, but not a single scientist has come forward. And so we found this huge disconnect between the scientific community, which, one, knew what happened, and two, knew that information could be used to prevent a further outbreak, but three, felt uncomfortable in the UN policy sphere or political sphere, lobbying or advocating for that change. On the other hand, you had the policymakers at the United Nations having absolutely no knowledge base about the current evidence and access to the experts. We didn't portray ourselves as experts, but merely liaisons or translators, working with the scientists to translate their findings into easily digestible information that non-technical experts could understand, but giving them, at least in that one middleman way, access to technical experts who've been doing this in country after country. Just again, as an example, Danielle has helped with improve water systems and water security in over 40 countries before she was working in Haiti, and continues to do that work today. So these are really people who are at the top of their field that they didn't have access to.
But why would the scientific community be so reluctant to acknowledge the causality of the cholera? What's the reason? I mean, the UN, after all, is not that influential.
Sure. So I think it was multifaceted. Unfortunately, the way that we conducted our study, we weren't really able to parse that out. But anecdotally and through convenience sampling, basically what we found was a couple of things. A lot of the scientists who first were researching the origins of cholera were being commissioned by governments. Whether it was through the CDC or PAHO or France or Haiti, they were being commissioned by governments. These governments were major players and troop-contributing members or members of the UN Security Council at the United Nations. So they had a vested interest in making sure that they wouldn't have to pay out billions and billions of dollars, or that the money that they were contributing to MINUSTA would drastically increase in terms of paying damages. And I think that filtered down because the first comments that came out of the scientific community against looking at the origin of cholera, which is basically how any epidemic for the last 150 years has worked. You find the origin and then you treat it at its source and prevent it. So the first words that came against 150 years of epidemiology came out of places like the CDC and came out of other, again, government-funded research projects. One of the government-funded researchers that did not follow that in lock and step was Renaud Pierroux, who is a microbiologist from France, who was paid by the French government but worked under the Haitian government, and he was the first part of the first team, the first Haitian-led team that looked at the origin, and he spoke out and actually was essentially ostracized from the scientific community. The Lancet, which published our work, saying that the scientists weren't doing enough, so they had come around. When he made his statements, they actually published an editorial that said that he has no business saying any of that, that it's politicized, he makes the scientific community lose credibility, it's not important. And so you had sort of pseudoscientists, and I don't mean that negatively, but people like Paul Farmer who kind of straddle the world of the science but aren't the actual researchers on the ground who are the world's cholera experts, saying things, again, probably from the pressure of being a UN Deputy Special Envoy for Haiti, but also being on the board of IJDH, so huge conflict of interest there, feeling a lot of pressure probably via Bill Clinton to say that the origins aren't that important. And so there have been efforts in the scientific literature to fight back, where there was sort of a consensus statement that fought back, and scientists have found their sort of subversive ways to fight back. As an example, this map that was, published in Nature, which is one of the highest impact scientific journals in the entire world, had a very subtle arrow that basically said cholera came from the United Nations. And in their text, they mentioned that too. And it's this arrow right here. So they with wave 3 in the text, basically what they say is from 2010, based on the scientific information, cholera came from Nepal to Haiti. But these are these subtle ways that stay mostly within the scientific community that if someone's not a scientist isn't really able to parse out and use in a tangible, effective way to rewrite policy. Basically, where we tried to step in was to work with the scientific community and the United Nations about on policy reform, both medical in terms of screening and prophylactic treatment, as well as sanitation in terms of how they treat their black water, how they store their black water, the use of soak pits for black water, the placement of those soak pits. For example, this was at the top of a hill right next to a major source of drinking water for the community. But basically what I hope to discuss today more is not just what the role of the scientific community could be, but what is the duty of the scientific community? What is their responsibility as bearers of truth and as the finders of truth? Is it enough to say we've found that truth? It's up to the activists and advocacy people to use that as a tool in the political sphere, or are scientists actually themselves responsible when they see policies being made not on correct scientific evidence and they have access to that scientific evidence? Is it their responsibility to bring that scientific evidence and technical expertise to the political sphere? The United Nations Security Council and General Assembly is a highly, highly politicized sphere where many things cannot go through despite their common sense nature. As an example, to change the medical support manual to create prophylaxis and screen all people coming from cholera endemic areas requires just changing a sentence. However, if anybody in the Security Council or the General Assembly got wind of that, they could quickly turn that into a political situation. Screening and treating everybody from a cholera endemic or epidemic area costs the United Nations $0. It doesn't cost them any money. It's not a publicized document, so they don't have to be transparent about it. They don't have to admit any guilt, not that there's a pending lawsuit anymore. But they failed to do that, and people at the Department of Peacekeeping Operations told me that the non-aligned movement, basically everybody except the G20, the non-aligned movement are the major troop-contributing nations to the peacekeeping operations. They would have to bear the cost of this. So if they found out about this, meaning changing so that every soldier had to be pre-treated with antibiotics, they would block that in the General Assembly and Security Council as the non-aligned movement. So it wouldn't just be Nepal fighting it. It'd be all the troop-contributing nations fighting it because they wouldn't want to take on the cost. So it becomes very complicated, and I myself am not sure of what the right answer is, and scientists often are so trusted because they stay away from the political fray, and that's how they maintain their credibility, saying we are providing information and merely information. The interpretation and use of that information is up to other people, i.e. advocates and activists. On the other hand, it's rare that the scientific community has such a consensus about what's going on, and there's such a disconnect between the science and technical expertise of the water experts and policy. So, I don't know that that's an easily answerable question, and clearly in our work we found that scientists, while very vehemently supporting the information and the facts, when it comes time to presenting that information to political power, shies away from that, and it requires third parties. And people who work in water as well as human rights, I think, straddle that, are sort of the perfect people because they have the technical expertise in water and sanitation, but they also have the understanding of the humanitarian world, human rights issues, and basically how human rights organizations and organizations like the United Nations function. So they can navigate that using the language of the United Nations, but also having the scientific expertise that other water experts and researchers have. So then, the question then becomes not just the duty of the scientific community, but what is the duty of institutions like the Carr Center for forwarding this. So that's about what I have in terms of laying the background, and just I'd be interested to hear, again, we have a varied background of people who've worked in the field and worked on policy, and I know some other people just came in, or came in a little bit later, so maybe we could hear from them too, what their backgrounds are, and sort of see where we get a consensus about what should be done going forward.
I'll start out as a lawyer, but a former litigator. One thing that's really frustrating about this thing is that the Nepalese sanitation system that they put in place doesn't even follow the UN guidelines that are already in place, and as Rishi pointed out, are weak. There's great videos of the pipe coming out of the compound, the creek, and kids are playing in it, and then the UN disassociated themselves with the epidemic because they hired a Haitian transport company to take it to a dumping field. And even though they had received complaints that the Haitian transport company was doing that improperly and illegally, they did nothing, but they're using that as a shield for their liability. And the New York Times, for people who want to read in more detail, has done considerable, extensive reporting on this. There's, I know Rishi's hosting a Cholera in the Baseball in the Time of Cholera movie, which really gets into these issues. But to turn this into a question for you now, it's been really perplexing as to the cost of the UN stepping up and doing the right thing and taking responsibility would have really solidified their intent in Haiti, and that by doing the right thing, it would have been so inexpensive, and that's always just perplexed me as why they wouldn't take on that minimal responsibility and then reassure the Haitians that they're there to help and not cause the damage which they have caused. And
yeah, you know, it's actually it's been a little mind-boggling to me for an organization that's spent so much time at meetings and educating themselves, and you know, one of their big critiques is that they do a lot of theorizing and thinking, but not a lot of acting. That they don't really understand from the fields of conflict resolution and apology how important an apology is. And I truly believe, based on my interactions and my clinical work in Haiti, that if they had in the moment said, you know, this could have been us, we're going to look into it, and when they found out that it was, apologized, that would have gone a very, very long way, much longer than away than I think they realized, and how important that would have been, as you said, to restore credibility. The United Nations itself as an organization is fairly well regarded in Haiti, but MINUSTA, the military mission, is pretty much universally reviled, except by the most elite social class in Haiti, urban social class in Haiti. And so for them to be already reviled, already hundreds of MINUSTA soldiers had been repatriated over the past couple of years because of videotaped evidence of sexual assault of minors and involvement in murder of children and Haitian citizens without any sort of prosecution. You know, there was already a credibility problem. But despite that, in that context, even if they had said, we're sorry and we are going to fix this, that would have been, I think, much more productive. But even if you look at the hard cost and they say that they don't want to take on the cost, certainly they must have known that they would never lose a lawsuit against them. The lawsuit itself, it hasn't been calculated how much it would cost, but it would be billions upon billions upon billions of dollars to pay those reparations. But the estimated cost by the IADB, the Inter-American Development Bank, for universal access, this is not MDG goals of access to clean water, but universal access to free, clean, potable water in Haiti is around $1.5 billion. The cholera elimination plan puts the cost at around $2 billion or $2.2 billion when you include the elimination of cholera. And that sounds like a lot of money, except for the fact that they would have been able to pay that off 2 years of the UN military budget in Haiti, not anywhere else, but in Haiti. 2 years of the UN military budget in Haiti would have met that cost.
But you know, Partners in Health got millions and millions of dollars. The Red Cross got millions and millions of dollars. I mean, this number of $1 billion to $2 billion for a new water supply system for Haiti has been bandied about quite a bit. When you compare it to, you know, it would take Paul Farmer organizing with the Red Cross together alone, you know, together the two of them, or maybe with one or two other NGOs, could have also dealt with this. So, you know, you struggling against the scientific community, against an organization like the UN that really isn't a monolithic organization. It's just kind of a bunch of different countries doing their own thing. But I think you could also make the same argument that all of these NGOs have failed to address the problem as well, and that they have actually received multiple amounts of what it would take to have prevented the problem. I mean, you're looking at who planted the first bit of cholera, but then you also presented that only 9 people in an epidemic, I think you used the term epidemic in Nepal, only 9 people died. I mean, that's kind of the early part of your discussion of cholera. And I was like, wait a minute, something is really missing here if you can have an epidemic in Nepal and 9 people dying. How many people have died in Haiti? To me, like,
yeah, over 8,000.
I am kind of with farmers. Who started it is less important than why are we not, with all of these billions of dollars, certainly hundreds of millions of dollars going into these NGOs, why have we made almost no progress? You yourself said that the rate of infection has doubled. So it kind of, just a kind of overall picture to, in terms of where do we go from here? Do I want to go chase down all of the scientists who know anything about cholera to find out why they didn't speak up? Strikes me as not necessarily the most important next step to take, but to figure out why, just like with the UN not being able to move forward, all of these NGOs seem unable to actually take action together. I mean, I think the UN failed to take responsibility for this because it doesn't feel like it has enough power over the contributing countries. That it's more of a network than it is an institution.
Certainly.
More than the scientific community is a monolithic institution.
There are many puzzling aspects to your story, I think. One of them is that, as I understand you correctly, this could happen again.
Yes.
Where the UN has troops.
That was going to be my comment to her, exactly.
In DRC, for example, where they have I don't know how many thousand troops.
Well, so not just DRC, so...
I mean, the contributing countries, the countries that pay for those troops, would surely have an interest in setting this right. And that's why I don't understand why this cannot be brought up in the UN and in the Security Council. I mean, you say it's politicized. Sure, it's politicized. But I mean, this is an interest where I don't think a controversy between the countries that matter in the Security Council. On the contrary, I think they would have every interest in cleaning up this mess and setting these inadequate medical procedures that you're talking about, setting that straight. So that to me is a puzzle.
Yeah, one thing, and you're much more versed on this, but one thing that's been really frustrating is that the UN's response has been to eradicate cholera from Haiti, and they're dumping, what's the figure that they're putting into this?
It's estimated needed $2.2 billion, but they've only put a couple million in.
And so, and initially, and that's one of the questions, is initially it came out that almost no money was going to infrastructure, but just reactive response to cholera and cholera treatment. And that sounds like it's changed.
Not too much, actually. And our work with the Haitian government and Haitian organizations on water was a bit out of the scope of this talk, but that's our second arm of the work, is working on water infrastructure, and actually that's the majority of our work. This was just a couple emails and some studies, but there's currently in this cholera elimination plan, the funds have sort of been recycled to funds that were never dispersed in the first place have now just been recycled and pushed over into this. So if they weren't dispersed for the earthquake and they weren't dispersed for cholera, there's no reason to believe that they'll be dispersed for this plan. That said, 0% of those funds, which none of which have materialized, go towards water infrastructure. Or water at all, clean water at all. They go towards cholera treatment. When in fact, all those numbers that I gave pre-cholera and pre-earthquake, where water was the major killer, all those waterborne diseases were non-cholera diseases. So if you treat the water and you get a water infrastructure, not only do you strengthen all the other rights, again, the ripple effect of the rights that are affected by the right to water, but you also treat all the other waterborne diseases, and that's how you improve the health. Vaccinating, with all due respect to Partners in Health, spending money on vaccinations produced by an international pharmaceutical company money, certainly treats cholera, but there's a more effective, more cost-efficient way to treat cholera that also treats, and it doesn't rely on the UN. Because one has to ask themselves, well, if all this intervention is causing these problems, whether it's NGOs intervening and not helping, or the UN intervening and causing problems like the cholera epidemic, do we really want to create a dependency on a funding mechanism that goes through the United Nations, where now they become more and more entrenched in the infrastructure of Haiti? Our goal, in my opinion, should be an infrastructure that is a national infrastructure, not one that is reliant on foreign assistance. Obviously, that's a long ways away when 67% of funding comes from internationally. But
why is the blame the UN and not the Nepalese government for failing to meet UN?
Because they didn't fail to meet UN standards. They followed the UN standards to a T, in fact.
But Mo, I'm wrong on that then. Their sanitation is what?
Oh, so the sanitation, the way that MINUSTA and the Department of Field Support monitors peacekeeping operation camps is that it's not really technically considered the Nepalese monitoring the sanitation. The Environmental Compliance Unit of the Department of Field Support, which is completely separate from different, I don't know the proper term, but different sets of troops from different countries, is the one responsible, and they're more of a national organization in each peacekeeping operation. Now, talking to actual soldiers and people in MINUSTA and the Chief of Mission Support, they say there's a huge variety, and you go to a Nepal base and you go to a Uruguay base, they're completely different, and the sanitation's different, and the infrastructure's different, but the fact remains is that on paper, the Environmental Compliance Unit, which is just this overarching umbrella organization that has nothing to do with Nepal, is the one responsible. Also keeping in mind that the Nepal troops were the newest ones to arrive to that camp, but that camp had a number of troops from different countries, India, Bangladesh. Nepal followed the medical screening to a T, and the sanitation was not followed, but based on UN documents, that responsibility, even if they contract to a private company, even if the soak pit is off-site, by the writing of these documents that are not, unfortunately, publicly available, the responsibility is the United Nations, not the country, not the troop contributing nation.
That works.
But one could change that so that there is an incentive.
One could change that, but it requires a concerted action at the high level.
Yeah, and
Could you explain what I mean, it's the blame issue, who's responsible and is there compensation? But I also didn't totally understand the going forward. Did I understand that you would like to see all peacekeeping troops be treated with antibiotics? Is the medical piece here so if you have been from an environment where there's lots of cholera around, you're going to have antibodies against it? Is this like TB where you might not have it but you've been exposed to it and so it's hard to test for it?
So there are different options, and I think that I don't have the expertise or information to do a cost analysis on an international scale of what would be more cost effective. But the options are, I think that every soldier that's coming from or going to an area where cholera is endemic or epidemic should either be screened for cholera or prophylactically treated for cholera. Prophylactic treatment is different than empiric treatment, meaning it's a preventive thing, not assuming that they have it and treating. So it's a shorter course, which also means that it's cheaper. But either one of those would be good, given the fact that screening tests are not 100% sensitive and actually more expensive than the antibiotic, which is generically available. My leaning is toward preemptively treating. This would, had they followed the scientific evidence and very quietly without any, so for me, the public apology is nice, and I think that's what the Haitians want, but I'm not Haitian. And so for me, that's not as important to me. What's important is that they follow the evidence, that they do the right thing with the medical screening. And if they had done that quietly, without acknowledging it, without claiming any guilt, without paying a dime to anybody, what would have happened is that, for example, coming up in August, 23 countries that are going to Nepal where it's endemic, and every fall rainy season they have an epidemic. The 23 countries that are going to be doing training exercises for peacekeeping operations and going to Nepal and then coming back to their 23 countries where cholera is not endemic would be prophylactically treated. But there you have a situation that's coming up in months, that the U.S. is sponsoring, that's coming up in months where someone is going to an area where cholera is rampant, is going to be exposed to it because the majority of people are asymptomatic, whether there's an epidemic or not, and then is going to go back to their country. So one of the spins that we've tried to use at the UN level is that, fine, if you don't want to talk about the people that you're serving, talk about your own troops and your own member nations. They're going to these very unstable areas where there's no health infrastructure and very little water infrastructure, and then they're going back to their home countries. Protect them. Protect your staff. Protect your employees, your peacekeepers.
Has that argument been made, actually?
Yes. Yes, it's as equally ineffective as the argument of help.
Well, why is that?
You know, I don't know, and I've tried. The Department of Peacekeeping Operations is not an organization or entity that's used to being lobbied. They're a very kind of quiet organization, very insular, and so gaining access was incredibly difficult. And once I did, it's this very obfuscating sort of organization. They say they are responsible for peacekeepers, but any health of the peacekeepers goes to the Department of Field Support. And you talk to the Department of Field Support, and they say, well, health, you know, we just listen to the WHO. And you go to the WHO, and the WHO says, well, we're not the UN. You know, go talk to the peacekeepers. And then they, you know, so you have no sense of hierarchy. All I know is that when I asked about, you know, Nepal and all these other places who've experienced cholera firsthand, who know what it's like and have successfully built infrastructures to result in only 9 deaths in a nationwide epidemic, shouldn't they all be banding together around to support Haiti and say, this is how we've done it, here's how you can do it? That I was told that it's a very politically sensitive subject, and to the point that, you know, there's a reason that only one research group was able to obtain Nepal samples from the epidemic, because they do not want to be in any way involved. And I think a lot of countries are taking it very personally or sensitively about what the implications of Nepalese troops introducing cholera.
Are you saying that this is politically sensitive in Nepal?
Very.
Yeah.
Extremely.
That we can understand.
Yeah, extremely. But I think that what was implied is that through the non-aligned movement, other non-aligned members, which again are kind of low to middle income countries but major troop contributing nations, sort of see themselves in Nepal and say this could have easily happened to us, and we don't want to be in any way dragged into the spotlight as as this country that's introducing cholera epidemics or introducing any other waterborne disease that's not cholera.
But now what about all the NGOs? Or do they all come from rich countries where they don't have cholera? I mean, you know, we're going to give the peacekeepers antibiotics, and I'd like to give every NGO and every church group that comes. Just because it's not prevalent.
Well, no, so, the UN doesn't have any way to legislate that, and when in our talks with the government in Haiti, it was very kind of nuts and bolts about increasing access to water, so we didn't talk too much about that policy stuff. But certainly, I mean, there are certain countries where you're required to get a hepatitis A vaccine, you're required to take oral typhoid vaccine, yellow fever vaccine. You take malaria prophylaxis. So adding cholera prophylaxis onto that, I think, is not that problematic.
I just went to Ghana for 3 months, and I had upon entering show a whole list of shots that I was required. So it's not. But I think in reality, and back to your question, I think in reality, yes, the NGO workers are mostly from Europe and the United States. And that seems to be, when you get on the ground, that's.
I can understand that the countries contributing the troops have a sensitivity about this, as you were just saying. What I cannot understand is why the countries that are paying for those troops, which are different, as you know, why they would be sensitive to raising this issue, and why they couldn't do this in concert, saying that the troops, there's a serious risk here that the troops will be
So then we have to send our own troops.
They will never do it.
So, it's interesting that the United States has been a good case study in that, the State Department in the U.S., because it's been hard to get a read on them. They they're sort of ambivalent, which is much closer to being outraged than any other country that we've talked to, in that they often are, so for example, last month, they actually sponsored a full day of lobbying and briefing of the entire UN Security Council by Haiti advocacy groups that were doing water advocacy. And, when 101 congressional representatives sent a letter to Susan Rice saying, what's going on with this cholera thing is unacceptable. We're paying this money, and if there are damages, we're going to have to pay the money. Obviously, they phrased it in a more perhaps ethical and empathetic way, but the bottom line is we don't want to be paying. This is our money. What are you doing with our money? We want answers. That she put a lot of pressure on OCHA and the humanitarian arm of the United Nations. So the U.S. at least has showed some sort of pressure on the United Nations to say, what are you doing with our money? What are you, because this is our money, because we are the people administering these peacekeeping operations, and which fall under the Security Council and the 4th and 5th Committee, we want to know what's going on. But I think it probably takes more than the United States. I think that talking to other UN Security Council members, Syria is very much on the mind and has really detracted a lot from other international issues, as well as the Middle East, of course.
But talk to the Scandinavians, talk to the Germans, talk to the Dutch. All of these countries contribute to money to UN peacekeeping operations.
Mm-hmm.
They should be interested in hearing you out.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, that's a good idea. Those are people that we haven't focused on.
And they're all represented in New York, obviously.
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
But this isn't, this has been in the headlines of, this isn't just one man's campaign. I mean, this has been front and center of the UN for quite some time, and there's a great movie on Jonathan Katz, who Rishi just posted about, 2 months ago? Mm-hmm. Wrote I always forget the last part of it, but the big truck that went by, how the world came to save Haiti and left behind a disaster. He's an AP reporter who's been on the ground. He talks about this and it's been really perplexing as to why it's evolved the way it has. I mean, because, why?
I think it's widely known that the Nepalese soldiers caused the epidemic. But all of these details that you provided now, I do not think are widely known. Mm-hmm. The inadequacy of the UN screening procedures, for example, and the refusal of the UN apparently to do something about it, to provide this bleach to the Blackwater pits. I mean, if you pile on such detail, I think many of these countries I mentioned would be susceptible to.
Absolutely, and that would be, that's why I'm also enjoying this discussion, because that would be a newer strategy for us. So that's something we haven't explored as much. But there's a great slide by IJDH. They gave a talk just last week about all the different ways that they're creating pressure on the United Nations, or how IJDH, or the legal community and the medical community, are just a small piece of the puzzle. And even people inside the UN are very angry, because they spent particularly in the development and humanitarian side, they spent their lives trying to help people, and here they are being dragged out in front for hurting people, and nobody's taking responsibility and fixing it. And I found that there's a big disconnect even between the military missions on the ground in Haiti and New York, and their superiors in New York. There's been a lot of sort of quietly voiced frustrations with how they feel their hands are tied by New York, and I haven't been able to figure out exactly why or who is doing that hand tying and why.
And the reason why Ban Ki-moon is stonewalling on this, and you had a slide that showed that the late February he made a statement on this. I mean, he should be held to account for that posture.
Absolutely.
I have two questions. One is, are there other diseases that one needs to be more aware of this transmission through peacekeeping groups or NGOs, such as dengue fever? I just learned today that there's river blindness in South America, which I didn't know. So one question is, just what you have to say about cholera.
Mm-hmm.
Are there other diseases that have parallel or maybe make this more complex?
Mm-hmm.
And then I have another question, which is, I tend to do this in seminar, it's a little challenging, but what is the question that you're asking here?
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm hearing a couple of different potential talks, and they read differently. So one would be, what's the legal and moral responsibility of the UN? And if that were the true question, and you spent a lot of time talking about that, if that were the true question behind your talk, if that's your scholarly purpose, what's the legal and moral responsibility? I would think you would then want to really explore what's the institutional structure of the UN, and what's the legal structure? Why does the why is the UN not have any legal liability? Why is there no legal mechanism to hold them responsible? How would they, what would be the appropriate? You tossed out a couple of billions of dollars in damage. How would we assess that? That's a whole scholarly area to look at. And I think there's this other question of, what's the best way? And you raise a lot of these different issues, right? What's the best way to prevent the crisis? And if we think, what's the best way to prevent a cholera crisis in Haiti? Boy, my first response to that is, forget the whole UN thing, get that IV tubing there. I mean, no more money to any other NGO until the place is just completely covered with IV tubing, if that's, because the treatment seems, as you yourself said, the treatment is so simple that seems like the fastest way to solve the problem, rather than struggling to get the UN to do whatever it needs to do to start giving prophylactic antibiotics. And, so the treatment, every other country knows how to treat it. Why doesn't Haiti know how to treat it? So if that were the core question, and then there is this other question of what's the best way to get the UN peacekeeping troops to have a better process about health issues as they go into other countries. And I think in terms of getting an audience at the UN, it would probably fall on more receptive ears if it weren't also tangled up in whether there should be compensation to Haiti or not, and whether there's a moral, whether they did something truly horrendous. If one thinks, and I kind of wonder whether that's why Paul Farmer is like, look, it's not really, we don't want to go there. I suspect he would be more willing to say, yeah, I want to look at what's the process that prevents the next one, rather than getting in a major struggle to get a compensation which we're never going to get,
Yeah, absolutely.
So like three different directions.
Before you go, let me throw one thing just from the sanitation aspect. The treatment might be easy, but the continuous infection is the issue.
Yeah.
You remember, this is a country with zero sanitation, and I've been on the Central Plateau where almost no water. So you basically got the sanitation and the water sources so intermingled that, yes, you might be able to put an IV in their arm and treat them, but then they're going to go back home and get it again. So it's not just a treatment, it's the whole, and that's why a lot of us are so frustrated that this whole, rid Haiti of cholera didn't say, let's get an infrastructure in place. Even Port-au-Prince would be a huge step forward. There's none. And after 2 years post-earthquake, there's still none, as Rishi pointed out. So I just wanted to point that out. Yeah, you can treat them, but then you send them home and they're sick.
Yeah, and that's the frustrating thing about cholera, and I bet you could probably add to this as well, is that during a cholera epidemic there's a lot of serotype switching. And so just because you've been exposed once doesn't mean that you're immune once the serotype switches. And so people get immunity to that initial serotype, but what happens is it switches, and they started documenting that just months into the epidemic, and it's continuing. And so people are getting second, third, fourth infections with cholera because it's a different serotype and they don't have immunity to that. But to your first question about are there any other diseases like this, yes, I would say that pretty much any waterborne illness could act in this manner, anything that's transmitted by the fecal-oral route. And, for example, in Haiti, before there was cholera, the major waterborne illness was typhoid and typhoid fever. So I think that and this sort of goes into your second question of what my question is. To me, cholera isn't the problem. It's the symptom. And I think that what we heard from our, not necessarily colleagues, but other people who were doing this work, was that they couldn't get any audience anywhere in the UN, even with their own country. So, for example, Canadian activists were trying to meet with the Canadian mission and weren't able to get meetings. And everybody was talking about cholera. And granted, this was during the lawsuit. But no one wanted to talk about it, not only because of legal issues, but I think that it didn't resonate with the United Nations people. And so what we did that, at the time at least, what I was told by all the other organizations, and was unique, was that we didn't talk about cholera at all. I never used the word cholera in my discussions with the United Nations. I talked about water. And I said cholera is only the latest example, but that I've been working, which wasn't entirely true, but that my colleagues have been working on water before cholera. We're going to be working on water after cholera. Cholera is just a symptom of what the real problem is, and the real problem is lack of access to water. And that really, really engaged the United Nations. And again, other advocacy organizations have had multiple meetings, but with just 2 or 3 different people, and they're usually foreign diplomats. They're not UN staff. And we've had 30-plus meetings with DPKO where, that you can't even find their building and they don't have a phone number listed. So we found that to be very, very effective. And one of the things that require that is distancing ourselves very much from the lawsuit. And I had to be very explicit. And it's the truth. It's not, and I say it flippantly in the meetings to be very blunt about it, but what I say is that, I don't care about the lawsuit. I don't care about guilt. I don't care about money. I don't care about reparations. What I care about is that my colleagues and my patients when I'm in Haiti are dying because they don't have clean water, and they were dying before cholera got there. They were dying before the earthquake. They were dying before you got there, and that's what I want to fix. And this is the perfect opportunity because everybody's looking to Haiti because of cholera. This is the perfect opportunity to capitalize on that and focus on water. And I truly believe that. I truly believe that focusing on cholera is the wrong tree. It's the wrong issue here. Whether it's a legal lawsuit or it's the moral question of, and my personal belief of the way the UN has been involved in Haiti's history is very problematic, and I have deep reservations about increasing that involvement or funneling money through there. And I think the advocacy community and the Haitian government is struggling with where they're going to get the funds. The people in DNEPA the water ministry are very well trained. They're trained by people like Danielle, in fact, and a lot of French folks, and they're very smart and they're very dedicated, and they have zero funding. They have no money to build these water systems, and it's a struggle to not just build them, but then, as we heard with the sewage treatment facilities, to keep them running. So I really think that that's where the answer is, because not only does it treat cholera, not only does it engage the UN and people that could lobby for money rather than talking about cholera, but it also, I lost my final thought, sorry. But I think that it treats more than just cholera. It treats all the waterborne diseases that we're killing. In 40% of rural deaths before the earthquake were due to waterborne disease.
What's the status of the lawsuit?
So it's currently been thrown out of a non-existent jurisdiction by the United Nations through that new, the New York Times article I referenced. So currently, what they're doing is with legal scholars who are interested in that idea of what is, how can one hold the UN accountable, are looking at other jurisdictions. The Supreme Court in the United States just ruled 2 days ago or yesterday that basically you can't file foreign human rights abuses under U.S. Jurisdiction. So that takes the U.S. out as a potential. They were looking at the United States. There's still international courts in Europe that they're working with European law scholars on for jurisdiction. So it's a work in progress. It's not down and out, but
there is an international court of justice after all.
Yeah, so they're looking.
It would be interesting to sue the UN in that forum, wouldn't it?
Yeah, well, if it could go to court, I don't.
I think that's limited to criminal law, isn't it?
Is it only necessarily?
ICC. Yeah.
If they're only looking for an apology, what about the Inter-American Human Rights Commission?
Yeah, certainly. Again, I don't know that. I don't know actually if anyone has looked at that. That's a good idea.
I mean, if we could argue that this is criminal negligence, And listening to you, I think you could do that.
Yeah, and that's what they were trying to argue initially, is that this was criminal negligence at the very minimum based on the treaty that they signed, the Status of Forces agreement that they signed with the Republic of Haiti.
And as to the question you wanted answered by this meeting, I thought that was your question.
Yeah, I mean, by this discussion, yeah, that's...
A question mark added.
Yeah, is sort of...
And I think the answer to that question is to speak out.
Yeah.
I mean, just to sit on important and relevant data and not doing anything about it, saying that others should speak out, I don't think that can hold water.
No, I agree, but I think that kind of combining both of your comments, that it's important, messaging is important, and targets are important. And that requires more than just the scientific community. They're very good at science, but I don't know that they're necessarily good at that targeting. And it requires specialists and experts to think, what are we asking? What do we want out of this? And who do we want it from? Who can give it to us? And I think, and I agree. I've had problems with it for a while, and that's why a lot of our work is with the government of Haiti instead of the United Nations. Is that focusing on the UN doesn't focus on the problem. If our true goal is to increase the right to water, the UN can't provide that, and in fact can harm that by disrupting financial flow to the government of Haiti. So what we really need to focus on is how can the government of Haiti and national organizations create a national water infrastructure. And that in and of itself is how a place like Nepal, where cholera is endemic and they have an epidemic every year, can only have 9 deaths. It's not because they eliminated cholera. It's because they have a water infrastructure. And that's why people there don't die of dysentery as well in as much numbers as they used to. So it really, truly, it affects health, it affects education, it affects water, it affects life, and to me that's the answer. And so it's figuring out how we can channel the scientific community and the advocacy community, which is listening to the voices of the Haitians who are angry and they want justice, and so they're focusing on the UN. How do you navigate that without telling, you certainly don't want to be dismissive of what Haitians want and what they're feeling, but how do you, what is the end game here? How do you really get that to secure the right to water?
Even if you have the right to water, how do you disseminate information about very inexpensive ways to purify?
Yeah.
I don't know if you know about solus, this idea of sticking it out in a soda bottle, water
Yeah.
bottle, so it
that
couldn't be any cheaper than that, could it?
But it's been very ineffective, and there's a new line of thinking on that, and that's called aspirational goals, and then products that are developed for the poor to be given to the poor, they don't take off.
Yeah, and that's been tried in Haiti, and it's failed because the Haitians, whether it's cultural or the fact that it's the way it's being given, they do not like that idea.
Yep.
It's never been, in any place that it's been tried, it hasn't been adopted. They just don't like it. On the other hand, they actually have been, again, it's anecdotal, but I've been hearing they've started to actually very much get used to the idea of bleach or chlorinating their water, to the point that when they're given non-chlorinated water, certain communities complain about the taste of the water, that they've become used to the chlorinated taste. The problem is the cheapest and easiest way to do that is with these electrolysis machines, which require salt. And there's no good enough grade or quality of salt available in Haiti, so the people that are doing that are transporting all their salt from the Dominican Republic, which, like, being surrounded by a body of salt water just doesn't seem to make any sense. But Haiti is this fractured infrastructure. The people who work at salinating or desalination plants on the coast aren't talking to the people on the inside who have these electrolysis things that are getting their salt. So there just really needs to be a lot more coordination, and I think less international intervention, not more, is what's needed to help that.
One of the problems, and it's universal, it's not limited to Haiti, is that this is really a poor person's issue. And you go into the wealthier parts of Port-au-Prince, and these are just not issues that even the people in the NGOs are dealing with on a daily basis. They have pseudo-sanitation. It basically just goes out, but it goes out of the compound. They get bottled water. There just aren't issues that the policymakers and the decision makers are really confronted with on a daily basis. And then that's, I think, so the funding doesn't go. And then stealing one of your facts from a lecture I heard you speak before, only 8% of the financial aid that went into Haiti actually went to the government of Haiti so that it could start. I mean, think about what's the unemployment rate, 50, 60%?
I mean, it's higher in the rural areas.
Yeah, so they're not they're technically unemployed. They're living in just a shadow economy. So there's no infrastructure. There's no finances. So all this money has basically been going to NGOs to do the work. When the funding's gone, they pull back, and the government itself can't fund the sanitation plants they're built. They can't put the infrastructure. And then Canada pulls out of its funding commitments, saying, well, geez, look at the Haitian government. They haven't really done anything. But they can't.
Right, and that's sort of the paradox. You know, Foreign Policy magazine calls Haiti a failed state, but they've never been given the opportunity to fail because they've never been given the chance to try at all. And that's, you know, it's interesting talking to some of the Haitians that work in policy. You know, they sort of say, paraphrasing them, they say, we'd rather have a Haitian failure than an international success because then it would be ours and we could learn from it. And that really has been the problem, is that there is corruption, it's true, and it's rampant, but then there's no funding because of that corruption. It creates this vicious cycle where they have no money. And so what happens is in Port-au-Prince, for example, when DNEPA had tried to distribute water, that it wasn't properly treated and people got sick. So the government water makes people sick, but the private water didn't. Now, it's not that the private water is better, because the private water, you know, there's no regulation of that either, and people are getting just as sick. But that's what they've relied on, and they've known from from event after event that they can't rely on their government. You know, as just an anecdote of what the who the Haitian government works for. One of the presidential candidates was in a plane going to D.C. with Mario Joseph shortly before the elections in November. And he was trying to express to Mario how important he was and how influential he was, and that's why, you know, he would be a very good president and you know, win presidential candidate. And so he took out a stack of business cards, and not a single business card was from a Haitian national. They were all from international capitals.
Can I ask you about the science stuff? I mean, a lot of the stuff has just been like, we're hearing these things over and over again, and we tear our hair out, you know? I mean, even the 8% numbers. So, you know, it's like, yeah, and how do we move forward, you know? Let me just ask you this question. You had up a picture of other pandemics. Where else? I don't know how many people have died in Haiti, but it's in the thousands, right? Maybe in the tens of thousands.
Yeah, it's about over 8,000, yeah.
Okay, so, but where else in the world have we seen that kind of death rate on cholera in the last 30 years? Because, I mean, Peru, for example, that is a lot of exposure to a lot of people, but it was like 100 people died.
Yeah, so the mortality rate has essentially been one of the highest in modern history, and the only mortality rates that come close to it, or you know, slightly inch above it, are areas in sub-Saharan Africa that were in war-torn regions. In basically, there are only a couple.
Okay, you had a lot.
Yeah.
73.
No, so these are the waves. So these are the waves of introduction. So cholera originated here. So this is all a single pandemic.
Yeah.
So it's just kind of going around the world over and over and over again. So this original wave came down here, but then it was staying here endemic in the country. And then, you know, there was a second introduction of a different strain, even though cholera from 73 was still infecting people. Then a new strain came in that they hadn't been exposed to.
Do you have any sense of the numbers in any of these sub-Saharan African countries, numbers of people who died of cholera?
I don't have the absolute numbers on me.
Because the thing that puzzles me is Haiti's not the only poor country in the world. Nepal is actually extremely poor.
Exactly.
Sub-Saharan African countries are extremely poor. All of these things that you say about lack of access to clean water. Yeah. Sub-Saharan African countries also have that same problem. So why is it so much? Why is the rate so much higher in Haiti than it is in Nepal, in sub-Saharan Africa? You know, this is the first story I've heard in my adult lifetime of this many people at this rate, and I don't know whether that's because I'm poorly informed about how the epidemics in sub-Saharan Africa.
Because some of the
Ethiopia.
sub-Saharan African countries are much, much larger. I mean, Ethiopia is 80, 90 million people,
Yeah,
and thousands die annually from a variety of diseases, and it won't be
From
noticed
cholera.
if a couple of thousand die from cholera, when others die from dysentery
So
and what have you.
so there's nothing peculiar about the Haitian situation, Ben? I mean, just
No,
from
I think-
income level.
Not
it
in
Sure.
terms of
strikes me-
numbers, I don't think.
Yeah.
I don't think so.
Yeah, the cases that have been similar in terms of fatality rate, it was different in the sense that they were war-torn at the time of the cholera epidemic, and it was often through refugee camps or IDP camps that it spread. And the numbers, in terms of absolute numbers, were actually far greater than Haiti. But in terms of case fatalities and percentage of the population, it's similar to Haiti. I think there are physiologic differences in the way the cholera epidemic has spread in Haiti, as well as infrastructure differences. Physiologically, the strain that went to Haiti from Nepal is a particularly severe strain, but it's one that, regardless of whether it's severe or not, Haitians had never been exposed to it in the history. So even, if for example, like another Caribbean country, they had been exposed, I would imagine that if, say, there's a Caribbean nation that hadn't been exposed to cholera for 100 years, but that same strain came to them, I would predict that their mortality rate would be lower and the severity of illness would be lower than in Haiti, because they, at least at some point genetically they had been exposed to that and those antibodies get passed down. Haiti had none because there's literally never a recorded case of an epidemic
And now it's
ever.
endemic in Haiti.
And now it's endemic. And
But criminal negligence.
yeah, and that's, it's, again, it's this, it's nice to say, well, we're going to eradicate it from the island, and it seems doable because it's a small island, but it's forever, I think, going to be part of the Haitian makeup. So I think that physiologically they were much more severely affected. Then second, in infrastructure-wise, in a place like Nepal, which is very, very poor and has a very poor infrastructure because they've been affected by cholera for essentially millennia. What they do, while they may not have infrastructure elsewhere, what they do have is a good cholera response system. Haiti had nothing like that. It had no epidemiologic system, and that was one of the recommendations of the UN, is to create that, because they had no way of managing the beginnings of an epidemic, whereas in Nepal, even though the epidemic is going to continue, they can at least prevent the deaths because they know there's a systemic way. In Haiti, when you had 3,000 people coming in, there wasn't a single cholera cot. There wasn't enough bleach, because these people are sometimes 20 liters of rice water stools a day. They're too weak to move. If they don't have family there, or their family's also infected, that bucket, holds maybe a couple liters. If it overflows, you've got to wash the whole area with bleach. But no one had that bleach. No one was able to produce it, dilute it, buy it. There weren't any cholera cots. There weren't enough buckets. So there was just absolutely no ability to respond to the epidemic in any way that they could have been able to. Certainly they did valiantly, and they were trained well, the Haitian first responders, but they just didn't have the equipment necessary.
Keeping Rishi late, so
Yeah.
yeah, cut it off. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Appreciate
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very interesting.
Thanks.